Back now to Laura Jays at the Sky News Centre.
Aaron Young in Melbourne, thanks so much for that. Now for a government view on what's been happening on the global stock market and more broadly global economies, including China, the United States and in the Middle East as well. I spoke to the Resources Minister, Josh Frydenberg. Resources Minister Josh Frydenberg, thanks so much for your time and Happy New Year to you. Arguably one of the biggest achievements of this government, the Abbott government mainly, was the China Free Trade Agreement. And what has been spruiked uphill and down dale is the benefits for Australian business and the Australian people more broadly. But does the volatility we've seen in China since the beginning of the year and the currency manipulation threaten to derail all that for Australian business?
Well, the China-Australia relationship is a broad-based one and the economic partnership is very strong. There's more than $150 billion worth of two-way trade between our countries and $100 billion of which is China buying products from us. Now, that is a broad-based agreement. There are lots of services that China buys and the agreement has reduced the barriers to entry for Australian service providers into China, but it's also reduced the tariffs on the resources sector, and that is very important for future exports. So yes, there is great volatility in the Chinese economy. It's coming back to normalised patterns of economic growth in China, but in terms of the overall benefits to Australia of this free trade agreement, it will continue to be very, very important and very, very positive.
It's often said that when China sneezes, Australia catches a cold. That's how closely our economies are linked. Given the global growth outlook and the China situation, do we need to, and does Australia need to get used to this new normal perhaps of slow wages growth and sluggish business investment?
Certainly in the resources space we're going to see a slowdown of investment. We saw $400 billion worth of investment in the resources space, particularly in LNG projects in Australia between 2003 and 2014. Now, while the pipeline of projects is still very strong for Australia and major announcements like an expansion of the North West Shelf project by Woodside and its partners last year was worth over $2 billion, there will be less investment in that space. But Australia's economy, Laura, is very resilient and it's very diverse, and other resource-dependent economies like Canada and Brazil were technically in recession last year because they had consecutive quarters of economic growth. In contrast, the Australian economy continued to grow, particularly there was growth in services and there were more than 300,000 jobs created and unemployment went down to 5.8%, the best number since 2006 in terms of jobs growth. So we're still very optimistic about the Australian economy. We've got to continue to reform, and industrial relations, tax, deregulation, infrastructure are all very important. But these free trade agreements do open up opportunities for us with our key partners in the region.
Looking at the explosion in LNG, for example, there's a few LNG projects that are due to come online that's being spruiked as really the next big thing. Are you concerned that these projects are coming on at exactly the wrong time for the market though?
Well, the LNG projects in Australia mainly have long-term contracts. For example, the Ichthys plant in Darwin, which was a $50 billion investment by companies like Total and Inpex from Japan, will provide much needed gas in Japan. And after the Fukushima disaster in Japan, with the closing down of a lot of their nuclear power reactors, we saw a big upsurge in the demand for gas. Now, Australia will provide that gas. So I'm confident, given that demand for LNG is very strong around the world, and given that Australia will overtake Qatar as the biggest LNG exporter in the world by 2020, that our exports and our investments will find much needed markets around the world.
Looking at the geopolitics and particularly the Middle East at the moment, Australia will lift sanctions against Iran. That's in line with this nuclear deal that's been done. But what are the economic benefits for Australia? Can you spell them out for us? Because there are concerns that Iran is about to flood the market with 500,000 extra barrels barrels of oil at a time where prices are already at a 12-year low. So to me it seems that this deal that America has done with Iran was more focused on the geopolitics rather than the economic ramifications.
Well, as Julie Bishop made very clear when the international community indicated that they were going to lift sanctions, that this was a result of long-term negotiations about the nuclear program in Iran. Now that decision was taken, and the international community will be very vigilant to ensure that Iran continues to meet its commitments about non-proliferation. As for Iran's decision to increase their oil exports, yes, that's coming at a time of low prices, and the increase in supply will certainly keep a downward pressure on prices. But there are many other suppliers in the world, and the most important of which is Saudi Arabia, and they've increased supply. So it's not just Iran coming on stream, which is an issue here.
Well, there are some resource analysts at the moment taking into account all those things that you have put forward as well, but suggesting as well that Australia should have a larger oil reserve. Is this something, as Resources Minister, you want Australia to look at more seriously?
Well, we have international commitments about the amount of oil that we need to preserve and have in reserve here in Australia. We're determined to meet those international commitments, but we're focused on capturing markets for Australian exports, but also ensuring that we've got the necessary storage of those oil reserves here in Australia, and we believe we can do both those things simultaneously.
Is that at the right level at the moment, though?
We are below what the International Energy Agency would like us to be, but this is an issue that we're working on with them, and our commitment is certainly to meet those obligations.
Just finally, can I ask you about Clive Palmer's Queensland nickel mine that has gone into administration this morning? Clive Palmer has blamed the falling in nickel prices. That's plain to see when you look at the way those prices have been charting down over quite some time. But he also blamed the Queensland Labor government for not helping him, not stepping in. Was this the right course of action? Was that a bit rich for Clive Palmer to look to the Queensland government for a bailout?
Well, I don't think Clive Palmer should be pointing the finger at state governments, indeed federal governments. He has responsibilities for his own workers and for his own commercial operations, and it's not for government to be bailing out these operations at a time of low prices and difficulties. Now that the administrators are in, it is hoped that the situation can be improved, and we're very focused on ensuring that those workers at the nickel refinery are given the best chance of employment.
Yeah, but looking at how Clive Palmer has run this business, there's been numerous articles about how much money he's transferred from that business into his political party. We've also seen, you know, over the last couple of years, him splashing out on Mercedes-Benz for some of his employees. Is there any cause and is there any recourse really to look at those business practices over the last 2 years? And, you know, is there question marks over you know, the ability of Clive Palmer to save this company rather than splashing out money on gifts such as the ones I mentioned and putting money into his political party?
Well, at the end of the day, a commercial operation's primary responsibility is to its workers, and in the case of publicly listed companies, to its shareholders. Now, Clive Palmer will have to answer those very questions that you are putting, and as to why he made those donations and that he splashed that cash around. They're questions for Clive Palmer to answer, because many people are asking just how could he do that when the company is in such a precarious position today.
And hopefully we can put those questions to Clive Palmer at some stage. Resources Minister Josh Frydenberg, thanks so much for your time.
Nice to be with you, Laura.